Good afternoon and hello and welcome to our ISE Fireside Webinar. We're very excited to have Eclypsium as our sponsor today, and we're going to be talking about mitigating device security risks in data centers, remote use of the supply chains. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things. For those that are watching our webinar today, we have added video, so we're very excited to have all of our panelists live with all of you today. And upon its completion, you will receive or earn a CPE credit. So you do have to participate in the entire webinar with us to earn that one CPE, but we're glad to have you. At the end of the webinar, we're going to have a survey that will appear in the window, and it will provide a space for you to include your CPE number. Then we can send you a record of the attendance of your participation today, and you'll be able to submit for your credits overall. So don't exit early from the webinar, or you'll miss out on the survey and the opportunity to get your CPE credits. Our webinar agenda today, we of course begun the agenda, and we're going to move into our panelist introductions. And then from there, we'll hear from our sponsor and some opening remarks sharing what they do. And again, thank you, Eclypsium, for being our sponsor today. And then we'll move into our panel discussion and have a series of topics to share with you and get the insights from our panelists. And then at 2:35, we'll pivot over to our Q&A session. There is a question feature here in the window of the GoToWebinar platform. If you have a question along the way, please go ahead and enter it into the screen, and we will be reading those questions and answering them at 2:35 and onwards. And then at 2:45, we will wrap things up. And if you are wanting to share on social media with us today, follow along at hashtag ISE Fireside, and we hope to see you out on LinkedIn and Twitter and all those good places out in the virtual world. So thank you again for joining us, and I'd like to introduce my fellow panelists to you. I'm actually going to have them introduce themselves, but I'd like to go ahead and introduce Mario. Mario, you can introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Thank you, Marci. Mario Chiock. I'm a fellow at Schlumberger. I was previously the CISO for several years, and today my job is to advise the executives of what we need to do today in cybersecurity to be ready in years ahead. That's it.
Thanks for being with us, Mario. We really appreciate it. Robert, would you be so kind to introduce yourself? We can't hear you, Robert. Are you muted?
There we go. Yep. The first technical challenge.
Okay, good deal.
Hey, my name's Robert. My name is Rob Mims. I'm the Director of Technology Security for Southern Company, and I was the former CISO for AGL Resources, the gas company. When AGL got acquired by Southern, I still have all of the responsibilities I had at AGL Resources, what is now Southern Company Gas, but I've gained responsibility for security operations support for generation, nuclear, and parts of the transmission environment.
And thank you again for being with us. Yuriy, would you be so kind to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Marci, for hosting us here. My name is Yuriy Bulygin. I'm CEO and founder of Eclypsium. I've spent about more than a decade finding vulnerabilities in hardware and firmware prior to founding Eclypsium.
Thank you so much for being with us. Yuriy, would you be so kind to share a little bit about all the great things that Eclypsium is doing out there?
Absolutely. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone is staying healthy and safe in this environment. Let me, instead of introducing what Eclypsium does, let me tell a quick story, a background story of how it came into existence. When I was a kid, I was living in a small town called Pripyat in Ukraine, and for those of you who watched Chernobyl series on HBO, you probably know that that's the town where the power plant blew up. So naturally, throughout most of my career, I've been gravitating towards finding ways to blow up computers. and for over 11 years, I guess. And what can cause computers to, what can cause that outcome? If you take any device that we're using today in daily life, whether it's in devices in our IT infrastructure, laptops and phones, devices at home, printers and home routers, devices in data centers, and other types of infrastructure, servers and storage and networking equipment, there's this mountain of software developed by manufacturers of those devices. And there's so much of it that even a trackpad runs its own operating system on a laptop. And just like any other software, it has vulnerabilities, tons of vulnerabilities, but it's so close to the hardware, it actually governs how those devices operate, that exploiting those vulnerabilities can cause permanent physical damage to those devices. That's what we've started seeing in some of the campaigns, some of the recent campaigns. But this is what I've spent a lot of my career on, in the past. But after playing this whack-a-mole game for some time, and after some of the notorious campaigns happened, including A&T and the Equation Group, we decided to open source a tool called ChipSec that helps researchers find those vulnerabilities. And it was a very important tool. It was very popular, and after some of the other campaigns, including Aurora, including Platinum campaign, a lot of folks started contributing to that open source project, and Google started massively contributing to that open source project. But it was mildly important, only mildly important to the actual teams that are tasked to protect their organizations from those attacks, because after all, it was a research project. We decided, we teamed up with my co-founder Alex, and started the company to build products that are actually useful to end organizations and the team who protect their organizations, to defend all of those devices all the way down to firmware and hardware level. So this is what Eclypsium does. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Let's go ahead and shift gears and start our panel discussions. Our first topic is going to be securing the backdoors into your data center. So what we know, cyber criminals certainly are targeting the enterprise data centers, and they're certainly exploiting security vulnerabilities to obtain it. There's both physical and cloud data centers, and they certainly have shared or experienced their share of breaches. Cyber attackers are certainly taking advantage of that and pivoting and taking advantage of the weaknesses in the firmware as well as the hardware level. And really, since data center infrastructures are commonly accessed remotely, attackers are really taking advantage of management backdoors like the baseboard management controller, BMCs for short, as a golden opportunity. By hacking a BMC or other firmware, attackers can move laterally, gaining access to the server and obtaining full control over the power of the data center. To prevent this, security leaders really have to take a greater care to observe good firmware and security practices within the servers, laptops, and other devices. So for instance, enterprises may integrate a firmware upgrade policy into a standard data center procedure. So the updates are implemented regularly and emergency planning is covered. So let's go ahead and shift into our conversations. And I'd like to ask our panel, what type of data center environments does your enterprise work with, and firmly on-prem, in the cloud, or hybrid? And sort of tell us a little bit about the unique challenges that you might be having to a sudden shift that we're having in a remote workforce, where pretty much I would say 100% of the workforce is working remotely right now. So how's that working in terms of security measures that you've had to take? And for Yuriy, I'd love to get a client perspective from you. So taking that 30,000 feet, looking at that holistic level when it is your turn to kind of give some perspectives. I'd like to start with Mario first.
Sure. So for us, we have a hybrid environment. About 5 years ago, I was tasked to move 80% of our data centers into the cloud for a lot of different reasons. But we still keep some servers in our own data centers. So we do have a hybrid environment. In the As far as challenges, we did not encounter challenges. The cloud was continued to work because the infrastructure is managed by the cloud service provider. And in our own data centers have been designed to have a minimum amount of personnel physically in the data center. Most of the data center is managed remotely by our people in Houston, in London, or in Singapore. So for us, it was just continue business as usual. The only big differentiator was that we had to actually be a little bit more careful when we make upgrade changes or patches, because we did not have the luxury to be able to get somebody there in physically in few hours. So we just a little bit more careful, but we haven't had any issues so far. What else do you have? Remote. What measures have we implemented? Our users normally connect to the data centers to the VPN. We use Palo Alto Networks Global Protect VPN. However, most of our data center, you cannot have direct access. You normally have to go through some jump host or some kind of server to connect to some of the devices. So we also blocking outbound traffic to only a few selected areas that are open for certain things. But in generally, our outbound traffic is pretty much locked down. That's very much it from my end.
Robert, what about your security team? Have they been able to pinpoint firmware and hardware vulnerabilities within the data center for you guys? Oh, you've got to unmute us again.
I'm going to learn. Okay. I'm trying to keep the background noise of my family away out of this. Okay. So yeah, for us, as critical infrastructure, the data center, we have, large, 1,000, 100,000 square foot data centers with all the hardening and backup power, water and cooling. But we also have critical infrastructure out in the field. We could have data closets or data rooms in an electrical substation or in a gas regulator station that is serving critical infrastructure. And to support it, you have to get some sort of remote access to it. And it all is running some sort of firmware and software. So we're very, cognizant and have that, concern around the risk of any sort of exposures or vulnerabilities that firmware might have. We engage heavily with our government partners. We believe strongly in public-private partnership because we recognize that, as large and complex as Southern is, we don't want to be at the mercy of the vendors. So in general, you kind of wait for the vendor to publish some sort of vulnerability and a patch for it or a fix for it. We partner with the government to actively go test and even reverse engineer and look for embedded malware in the supply chain and that sort of thing for some of our critical components. That's how we try to be proactive about it, but we also have strong vendor management programs where we require the vendors to do some of those testing and certify to us that that has been done and that their equipment is free of certain defects. Those are the steps we take, some of the steps we take to address that.
Yuriy, what about you from your perspective? And maybe you could shine a little light on what kind of technical and soft skills that would be necessary to locate and mitigate firmware vulnerabilities in these different organizations. And what kind of capabilities do you think people are really, or companies, I should say, are more in need of to do the firmware threat detection and scanning that is really necessary out there?
Absolutely. Marci, so all of this firmware is just a word for software that is developed by someone else, by a manufacturer of that equipment. And if you take a server, it's a really good example because servers is what power our data centers, is what power our cloud infrastructure and even critical infrastructure. A server, there's a phrase, software eating the world. Now, software is eating hardware for the last decade. And the reason is, if you take that server, the hardware is not monolithic in that server. It has up to 100 different components, including network cards and hard drives and embedded controllers, baseboard management controllers, CPUs, and so on and so forth. And all of those components, they contain that they have that software that is developed by manufacturer. So when we think about that software developed by manufacturers, just like about any other software, then we can apply the same techniques, the same tools that have been available to us, that have been used in the last couple of decades to secure software. And one of the most important capabilities, or initial capabilities, is just to keep it up to date, because vulnerabilities in firmware, they live for months or even years. For example, you'll probably remember Spectrum meltdown. It took 6 months to just develop a patch for those vulnerabilities, and that patch wasn't really just a simple patch as we sometimes do in the software world, but it spanned the CPU microcode, the firmware that goes into every server, every laptop, every other system at the system level, at the motherboard level, and an OS support for to mitigate those vulnerabilities. So it took even longer to deploy those updates, and some of those updates caused issues, so they need to be redeployed. So it took over a year for organizations to actually patch those vulnerabilities, and this is a common case for any vulnerability at that level. So this patching capability is incredibly important. Of course, just like in software, we need to understand the exposure, we need to understand the risk from the hardware firmware vulnerabilities. We need to be able to understand what are the vulnerabilities in our hardware firmware, and what is their impact. Are they in critical assets or not? How are they exploitable? Are they remotely exploitable or locally exploitable? And so on and so forth. But so that kind of brings the level of health of each device to certain level that we expect. But as we know, regardless of patching, regardless of identification of vulnerabilities, the exploits, the malware will get in, and it is absolutely critical to make sure that we're able to detect those attacks as they happen. And to Rob's point, we can trust manufacturers of our devices to do the right thing, especially if those manufacturers are someone that we've been working with to implement mitigations in their hardware, to release firmware updates for their hardware, and so on and so forth. But we need mechanisms to verify that trust. We need mechanisms to verify that everything has been done as we expect. What we received is what we expect and doesn't have anything extra in it that might have been added somewhere in transit. And that this hardware is configured properly, as well as those vulnerabilities are patched. So those are probably the skills and technologies we need.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing those insights with us, Yuriy. I'd like to sort of shift gear right now into our next topic, is the high-risk remote environment. We know over the last 6 weeks or so, we have really had to shift to a remote use workforce very, very quickly. For some, it's been quite high risk. Instead of employees, for example, operating in the office or even traveling with their corporate laptops, they're now working from home, which poses a whole new set of problems in that they're using their own devices in the home, like routers and internet. There's other devices, there's other access to the computers themselves. The enterprise networks are being accessed again through the home version. So the cross-pollination between the company and home devices is really kind of giving some folks some heartburn and exposing the sensitive data to further risk. So the risk itself can't be solved by providing loaner laptops or even wiping devices per se after use. So once you introduce the possibility of that firmware is vulnerable to remote attacks, especially if any of your users in their households are engaging in unsafe online behaviors, or there might be using the laptop for multiple purposes like distance learning or some other social type of applications to stay in touch with family and friends. So at the end of the day, the landscape rapidly changed because of the remote workforce. So with that said, how would you rank your security preparedness in supporting an entirely remote workforce? Mari, you kind of already answered that question in the fact that you've already been doing that for quite some time. So I'm going to have a different kind of question for you, but I'd like to get Robert's perspective on, how the working remotely, because you guys are field oriented. There's a lot of different controls in place or devices. So to some degree you've been doing it, but the landscape quickly changed. So Robert, would you give some insights on that for us?
Sure. The landscape did quickly change. So when this first started for us, when Southern started working from home, and we followed the governor's orders for the states that we operate in, our biggest presences are in Georgia and Alabama and Illinois and Mississippi. We, for the first 3 days of working at home was, we discovered bugs in our remote access. There were technical challenges. It was working, and our normal, we have 35,000 employees. Normally on any normal day, 3,000 of them are working remotely somewhere. During hurricane operations or large storms, our previous peak was around 7,000, and our current peaks any day now during the past 6 weeks is around 16 to 17,000. And so infrastructure supporting that many remote access, it's got to be pretty robust. So we discovered, there were certain issues in our firmware in one of our VPN gateways within the first 3 days. And it was a very obscure setting that it took several layers of support from the vendor to discover it and fix it. But they got it done, and then within 3 days. And then since then, it has been very stable, supporting that number of users every day. It has worked well, and there was a lot of planning and preparation, you can imagine, to make that happen. Since most of our infrastructure is out in the field, supporting that securely is just normal daily operations for us. And so that really wasn't a change. The biggest change, Marci, like you were saying, is just people using their, personal equipment to connect to the network. Not every employee has a company provided laptop. We feel pretty strongly about the security controls we put on the laptops that we image.
Absolutely.
So we have, several secure methods of gaining remote access to the technology resources you need within Southern Company. And if you're using a personal laptop, you don't just get on the VPN and get dumped on the network like you would if you had a corporate laptop. There are other methods. And so in general, we restrict you to remote access to a Southern Image machine, or we provision you with a VDI. There's different methods between Citrix and other application delivery mechanisms. But those were all in place prior to the pandemic operations. For us, the challenge though is remote support. So you were talking about personal routers, personal network infrastructure, and if employees who may not be that technical are working from home and start having issues, and they call the help desk. Now the help desk becomes the troubleshooter for every brand of router you can imagine, and cable gateway and whatnot. That we have definitely experienced that challenge. There's no easy answer to it.
No, there's really not. And it was one that has rapidly changed her home office environment to accommodate Zoom meetings and go-to meetings like this. It's been quite an interesting endeavor. Mario, what about detecting and monitoring and controlling when a new device is connecting to your enterprise network, and especially so remotely? I know you've somewhat had this all somewhat in place due to the way you guys are set up already, but there still has to be some aspects of a lot of new things trying to connect pretty much overnight. So how are you kind of dealing with that?
Yeah, so in the corporate network, we use Cisco ISE to control every port. So anything that gets connected, you only have access by default to the guest network. And then if you need to connect to certain other areas, you need to fill out an application, and then this can be done online. So connecting stuff in the corporate network has been, I mean, actually, we have seen that slow down a lot since we started with this, because a lot of our locations shut down. We only have the operations and manufacturing people actually in the office. However, people are creative, and they do try to plug in things. They feel that they're not being watched. So when they connect something, they will just connect to the guest network. And then if something doesn't work and they need to connect it, they will have to ask for some help to connect things. One of the big issues that we had was people trying to get printers to work, or as they were setting up satellite areas to work. And because of the security that we had put, they were pretty much locked down. So we did that. The second issue that we had during this lockdown was trying to patch.
Oh, Mario, we lost your audio.
Oh no.
Mario.
So yes. Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. So one of the issues that we had was trying to patch all of the remote users simultaneously while they're at home. Not because we cannot do it, just that was eating up a lot of bandwidth. So we had to kind of fine tune and ask people to leave their corporate asset enable online at nighttime. So, we could actually try to optimize patching during the off hours in the geographical area where they were. So that was a lessons learned.
Oh, well, that's really insightful that you guys did that, and very creative overall.
Yes.
No, I think that's creative that you had the devices left on at night so that they were able to be patched and not lose productivity during the day. So that's actually a great best practice. Yuriy, how about when a critical device and its data has been compromised, how would Eclypsium really address that and isolate the threat? And how would a security team respond to something like that in your world?
Thank you, Marci. When I think about this environment we're currently in, and I'm forgetting where I heard that, but most of the organizations have capabilities to work from home. Some of their employees work from home remotely, even before this pandemic. Right now, what happens is this suddenly accelerated to 90% and above employees working remotely from their homes, and in a short period of time, with all of the consequences. And the consequences include, how do you, problems, how do you support this remote environment of your workforce with all of their laptops that now they can bring their own devices, their personal laptops, they can purchase those laptops somewhere. Those laptops need to be somehow updated, both at the software level, at the firmware level. They also connect to home routers and printers and so on and so forth. Those routers need to be updated. There were at least 13 different router campaigns against the home routers in the last half a year, and now they accelerated because of the COVID pandemic, because those routers had never been patched. And so all of those kind of complexities associated with that part of the remote work environment. But there's another part of work environment, the infrastructure that supports it. All of the appliances, all the VPN appliances and ADC appliances that now need to support remote access. And so what we're seeing is that in addition to just reliability and bandwidth issues, those appliances are becoming a target of adversaries today, because getting to those appliances essentially gets crown jewel for the attackers, they can now compromise all of that remote access. And so that's what we've been seeing recently with Citrix and Cisco appliances being targeted. So there are two sides of this remote environment that needs to be taken care of, both from the patching perspective and risk management perspective, as well as from the perspective of detecting those threats and ensuring the integrity of those devices. So that's I think that's what needs to be done in the current environment, and that is again very similar to the capabilities that need to exist in the software space on those devices.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Yuriy. I'm going to go ahead and let's go ahead and shift topics now to our final topic, which is your supply chain, the next crucial attack vector. So we've seen the supply chains across the world kind of go upside down with the COVID pandemic. And we've really had to adopt a lot of new technology and software to accommodate remote workflows and communications really at a very rapid pace, meaning we might have neglected some of the security due to basic due diligence and lifting up these networks very quickly. So sophisticated attackers can put implants, backdoors, and other vulnerabilities within the device hardware. And some of these weaknesses really inadvertently could occur due to mistakes or just insecure practices in general by the point of the technology lifecycle. So I'd like to start with you, Yuriy. Tell us a little bit about how a current SCRM process might look like and how often should it be updated? And I'm going to ask everyone to kind of consolidate our answers so we have some time for our Q&A from our viewers today. So go ahead, Yuriy.
Absolutely. So the supply chain, is a very convoluted and complicated environment, and especially in the hardware space. When you purchase a server or a laptop from a manufacturer, you don't really know all of the parties that have developed code or developed hardware components for that server or laptop. As an example, there were recent vulnerabilities discovered in a firmware for the baseboard management controllers by a company called Avocent for T.E.N, and that is a management chip that is responsible for managing remote management, lights out management of all the servers and data centers. And that component is just one component, but it's a computer inside a server with Linux on it and so on. That component ended up in servers of at least 7 different server manufacturers. This is just one example. So how do you know that a server from HPE or Dell or Lenovo or other manufacturers you're receiving is really contains code and hardware from those manufacturers? So that has been convoluted enough. Now with the current crisis, the current crisis exaggerated this complexity because now the manufacturers are now switching their supply chains to build resiliency and to swap components on demand. So you had that complex ecosystem before, and now it can change modal by modal, manufacturer by manufacturer, because they do that to build resiliency against disruption of components in their supply chain. So now you really are getting a bag of goodies instead of a server, instead of a laptop, or instead of a router. You don't know what's inside. So the validating controls now have to happen at the end, at the receiving end. You need to be able to validate that what you're receiving is good. Same happened with the remote employees, because now instead of using corporate laptops, they can go to a shop or maybe order online, or maybe use their personal laptops instead of a corporate laptop. So now you don't have a visibility into what is inside that laptop, really.
Yuriy, I'm going to move on to Mario because we've got a limited window of time, and I want to get a couple more perspectives from Mario and Robert. Mario, what about how often are you scanning devices and hardware infrastructures for vulnerabilities? And has there been any startling surprises for you?
Yeah, so for our standard IT infrastructure, routers, servers, those are run in a regular basis. Some are daily, some weekly, some monthly, but they are very well scanned. The problem that I find are those devices that.
Oh, you're cutting out.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah. So the big challenge that we have seen, and by the way, I hired a red team every so often to come in and look and do crazy things like try to compromise a printer or a video conference equipment, and surprisingly, it is one of those things that are not part of the standard IT process, like a laptop and a server. We know that Patch Tuesday, you need to patch, you have a window very quickly to patch. But when you're talking about, other devices and sometimes even routers, the process is not always in place. We learned a lot. We did a lot of acquisitions in the last few years. And when we were trying to go through the acquisition to the merge process to onboard a company that we acquired, we found some of these devices that were never patched. So you need to make sure that don't let some of those things fall through the cracks. Many people, I talk to a lot of CISOs and a lot of security people, and they believe they have a very good process, and they do for standard equipment, but there's a lot more to it, especially now with the industrial IoT. Industrial IoT and IoT itself is going to be very dangerous.
Robert, how about you? What about how often are you scanning and hardware infrastructures and for vulnerabilities? And what about you finding any major surprises?
So depending on the environment, we're scanning constantly. I mean, we're scanning our enterprise environment. It is always being scanned. It's so large and complex that you couldn't just schedule them once a night and expect it to be done. It's going constantly. And then it's interesting, as Mario was talking, he's checking a lot of boxes for me, and probably for the audience too. We all have these similar problems. We also hire pen testers. We have an in-house red team that does custom attacks against specific environments, generally in response to an incident that they might have recently experienced, or one that we think that a risk assessment that we completed where they check it as a high risk area. We'll point the red team at them to show the business that hey, this risk really does exist, and there's vulnerabilities, and that determined attackers can exploit these. There are other areas, though, in the business where you can't do active vulnerability scans, particularly within critical infrastructure, within the OT or operational technology environments. You can't run ping sweeps. That could compromise some of the small specific components, RTUs, PLCs, things that run critical infrastructure that aren't designed. They're not enterprise technology. They're not designed for standard TCP/IP communications even. And in those cases, segmentation and access control is a strong control for us. We segment those environments off. They don't touch the internet. They don't touch the business network. They get segmented off from other areas of technology within the OT environment because they're vulnerable, and in some cases can't be patched or updated. In environments as large and complex as ours, inevitably there's some application that has a dependency on some older operating system, which has a dependency on the older hardware that it sits on. We know there are vulnerabilities. The vendor doesn't even patch them anymore, and yet we have to run them because the application for different requirements can't be updated. And so we get creative in our controls to ensure that those vulnerabilities can't be exploited. And segmentation is a big part of that equation.
Thank you very much, Robert. So we're going to shift gear. We've got some questions from our audience today. The first question is, how is Global Protect helping in managing uncorporate managed devices? For example, if you see a personal device and don't have a virus scan, how do you cut it off? I'm going to have one of you guys do it because I want to make sure we have enough time for all of our questions.
So,
Mario, Robert, or Yuri?
Yes, I'm happy to answer this. So first of all, we do not use Global Protect today for unmanaged devices. We use Citrix or VDI for that kind of environment. But Global Protect does have something called the HIP, which does a health check of the device before it connects. So even in our corporate managed devices, if the health of that device is not good enough, we don't allow that device to connect to the corporate network.
Our second question is anyone using FIPS validated hardware when it is available for a particular piece of hardware? Would anyone like to answer that question, or is anybody using the FIPS validated hardware in their environments?
I think it's definitely important to to use hardware that needs to be validated with FIPS, and I assume 140, and use it. However, we've seen, this is just like any other protection that is built into the hardware and firmware. Those protections may be misconfigured. They may be missing. They may rely on firmware that has vulnerabilities and needs to be patched. And we've seen some of the vulnerabilities that are affecting specifically FIPS mode of secure devices and not affecting non-FIPS mode. So these examples exist, and it's important to, regardless whether you're using FIPS validated devices or not, to have controls, independent controls that you can assess independently of what vendor is claiming.
Thank you very much. Robert, did you want to add something? I thought you might have were saying something. No? Okay.
So we don't have the specific.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say we don't have a specific requirement for FIPS devices, but we do reference that in some of our standards and for particular environments that are critical. And if for example, if a business unit who owns the environment wants to go out and implement some firewall that their team is a fan of that just happens to not be FIPS compliant, and we want to use that as a reason to help influence them to not use this particular firewall, to use a different standard that we've already known and tested and can support, we're not above using that to help us influence business partners to make better decisions.
Thanks, Robert, for offering your additional insight there. For everyone on the call or webinar today, don't forget to fill out this survey. So it'll appear once the webinar concludes so that you can provide your CPE number, and then you'll receive a record of submitting credits for your continuing education. I want to say many thanks to Yuriy and Mario and Robert for being a great set of panelists today. I want to thank our audience for being here with us today. I hope that everyone stays healthy and safe and continues to enjoy some of this beautiful spring weather that we're having and getting outdoors. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. We'll be back on Thursday at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 11 a.m. Pacific Time for our next ISE Fireside webinar. Thank you very much.